What happens when one of Hollywood's biggest stars sits down for what should be a lighthearted chat, only for it to spiral into one of the most uncomfortable moments in daytime television history? The Kelly Clarkson Show has always been known for its warmth, laughter, and genuine conversations, but Channing Tatum's appearance shattered that reputation in spectacular fashion. The interview began like any other. Kelly welcomed Channing with her signature enthusiasm, her bright smile lighting up the studio as the audience erupted in applause. Channing walked onto the stage waving to the crowd and took his seat opposite Kelly. The atmosphere was easy and upbeat. Kelly started with friendly questions about his latest project, a highly anticipated film generating plenty of buzz. Channing responded smoothly, talking about the creative process, the challenges of the role, and all the expected promotional details of a Hollywood press tour. Then, something shifted. Kelly leaned forward, her tone changing from casual interest to something sharper. She brought up an old interview where Channing had made candid comments about fame, the industry, and the toll it takes on personal relationships. Most hosts might have handled it gently, turning it into a reflective conversation about growth. But Kelly pressed harder. She asked whether he still stood by those comments or if they were just things he said to protect his public image at the time. There was an unmistakable edge to her tone, a challenge that lingered in the air. Channing's smile faded slightly. He paused longer than usual before replying that it was interesting she'd bring that up, especially when there were so many other things they could discuss about his current work. His response wasn't aggressive, but a quiet defensiveness crept in. Kelly didn't back down. She insisted it was relevant. Her viewers, she said, deserved to know if public figures truly believed what they said, or if it was all just part of a performance. That word seemed to hit Channing the wrong way. He leaned back, studying her, before calmly replying that everyone in the entertainment business performs to some extent, including talk show hosts. That's not dishonesty, he said. That's just understanding the medium you're working in. The air in the room shifted. The once cheerful audience fell silent, sensing the rising tension. Kelly's smile tightened and she tried to pivot, mentioning that in that same old interview, Channing had emphasized the importance of authenticity. Then, with unsettling directness, she asked, "Do you feel you're being genuine right now, or is this just another performance?" The question landed like a spark in a room full of dry leaves. Channing's jaw tensed as he asked what exactly she was getting at. He said he came on the show to talk about his film, to connect with her audience, not to be interrogated about his character. Kelly shot back that she wasn't questioning his character, only asking the questions her viewers would want answered. "It's my job," she said, "to get past the surface and find something real." But Channing wasn't having it. He countered that there's a difference between asking hard questions and setting someone up to look bad. He said he could feel the way she was steering the conversation, framing everything to fit a narrative that had nothing to do with why he was there. At that, Kelly's demeanor hardened. She told him that if he couldn't handle questions about his own public statements, maybe he needed to rethink doing interviews altogether. The silence that followed was thick enough to cut. Even the cameras seemed to hesitate. Then Channing leaned forward, his voice low but steady. He said he could handle any question, but he wouldn't sit there and be disrespected in front of millions of viewers. He accused Kelly of twisting his words and taking things out of context, saying it felt deliberate. The tension in the studio was undeniable, the warmth of the Kelly Clarkson Show replaced by a cold, electric discomfort. Kelly shot back, her tone sharp but controlled, insisting she hadn't twisted anything. She said she was simply asking Channing to reflect on his own past statements and that if he felt uncomfortable, maybe that was something he needed to examine within himself instead of blaming her for doing her job. The exchange was now spiraling fast, both holding their ground, neither willing to de-escalate. Channing took a long breath, visibly trying to compose himself, but the frustration was clear on his face. He told Kelly that he'd done hundreds of interviews across his career, sat with countless hosts, and never once felt ambushed like he did in this moment. There was, he said, a way to ask challenging questions respectfully, and this wasn't it. Kelly's eyes flashed, her posture stiffening. She said she found it fascinating that a man who built his career playing tough guys and action heroes was suddenly playing the victim because she asked him to stand by his own words. The remark landed like a punch. Channing's face hardened, shifting from irritation to genuine anger. He called it a cheap shot, saying it was unfair to reduce his entire body of work to a shallow stereotype. He made it clear that he'd never claimed to be a tough guy in real life, that those were roles, characters, fiction. The fact that Kelly couldn't separate the performer from the person, he said more about her interview style than about him. The audience sat frozen, caught between disbelief and discomfort, unsure if this was some elaborate skit or a real clash unfolding before them. Kelly leaned back in her chair, crossed her arms, and asked if he was always this defensive when someone pushed back. She reminded him that she'd interviewed plenty of celebrities who could handle direct questions without, as she put it, falling apart. Channing laughed, a cold, humorless sound, and said he wasn't falling apart at all. He was calling out what was happening in real time. He accused her of trying to manufacture drama for ratings, of turning an honest conversation into a spectacle. Kelly's tone rose slightly, the polished calm of a talk show host beginning to crack. She insisted that if anyone was creating drama, it was him. He, she said, had escalated a simple exchange into a confrontation. All she'd done was ask fair questions and he'd turned it into something else. Channing shook his head, calling that revisionist history. From the moment he sat down, he said, she'd been steering the conversation toward conflict, and now she wanted to make him the bad guy for noticing. Their voices overlapped as the back and forth quickened. Kelly argued that she was doing what her audience expected, being real, being authentic, not throwing softball questions. Channing countered that there was nothing authentic about it. It felt premeditated, calculated. He asked if she had planned to make him uncomfortable before the interview even began. Kelly denied it immediately, saying she never came into an interview with an agenda beyond having an honest discussion. But Channing pressed her, asking how dredging up an old interview, something with no connection to his current work, qualified as genuine conversation. Kelly replied that it gave context, that it showed growth or lack thereof, and helped the audience see the full picture of who he was. Channing scoffed, saying that was nothing but a gotcha tactic. If she truly wanted to give the audience a fuller picture, he said, she could have asked about his charitable work, his growth as a father, or the creative risks he'd taken lately. Instead, she'd gone straight for the one topic guaranteed to put him on edge. Kelly's tone turned cold, clipped, and deliberate. She said she wouldn't apologize for asking tough questions, and if he couldn't handle the heat, maybe he should stick to puff-piece morning shows. That was the final straw. Channing stood up, not in anger, but with deliberate resolve. He said he was done. This, he said, had stopped being an interview and become something else entirely, something he hadn't signed up for and wouldn't continue. Kelly looked startled, her confidence wavering for the first time. She urged him to sit back down, saying they still had more to discuss, but Channing shook his head. There was nothing left to talk about, he said. It was clear this conversation would never be productive. Kelly's voice softened, almost pleading, though whether it was genuine or another performance was impossible to tell. She said he was overreacting, that they could move on to other topics. But Channing wasn't interested. The problem, he said, wasn't one topic. It was the tone and approach she'd taken from the start. He said he'd tried to stay gracious and answer her questions honestly, but it was obvious she'd come in with a pre-decided narrative. Kelly rose from her seat now, too, insisting that wasn't fair. She said she'd given him every opportunity to explain himself, but he'd chosen to be combative. Channing turned to face her directly, his voice steady but firm. He said he'd been nothing but professional until she began taking personal shots, questioning his integrity and implying he was fake. If you think this is me being combative, he said, you haven't seen combative. But I'm not going to sit here and smile while you tear me down. Kelly fired back that she wasn't tearing him down, that he was projecting his own insecurities onto a perfectly normal interview. That word, insecurities, was the breaking point. Channing's eyes narrowed. He told her she didn't know a thing about his insecurities, that she was making assumptions based on a 20-minute conversation. The arrogance it took to think she could psychoanalyze someone she'd just met, he said, was astounding. Kelly retorted that she wasn't psychoanalyzing him at all, just responding to what he was showing her in real time. And what you're showing me, she said sharply, is someone who can't handle being questioned. The audience sat in complete silence, some exchanging uneasy glances, others frozen in disbelief. Channing told her she was wrong, that being questioned wasn't the problem. It was the hostility behind the questions, the way she crossed from journalism into antagonism. "And you've crossed that line more than once," he said flatly. Kelly bristled, saying she resented the implication that she'd been hostile, that she'd maintained professionalism throughout while he had grown increasingly aggressive. The tension in the studio was unbearable now, the atmosphere charged with disbelief as one of daytime TV's most polished hosts and one of Hollywood's most charming stars clashed in real time before a stunned audience. Channing laughed again, the sound sharp and bitter. He told Kelly that if she thought she had been professional, then their definitions of professionalism were worlds apart. A professional interviewer, he said, tried to make their guest comfortable enough to open up, not cornered enough to shut down. Kelly countered that maybe some guests needed to be cornered, that sometimes discomfort led to truth. Channing asked what truth she thought she was uncovering, and what grand revelation she expected to get by making him feel attacked. Kelly denied trying to attack him, insisting she was simply trying to get past the rehearsed answers and the carefully managed public image. Channing replied that his image wasn't managed, it was just who he was, and that her refusal to believe that said more about her cynicism than his authenticity. Not everyone in Hollywood was fake, he said, and her assumption that they were was exactly what was wrong with this kind of interview. Kelly told him he was being incredibly defensive for someone who claimed to have nothing to hide. Channing shot back that he was defensive because he was being attacked, a completely natural human response. If she came at anyone the way she had come at him, he said, they would react the same way. Kelly disagreed, saying she had asked tough questions to plenty of guests, and none had responded like this. Channing replied that maybe those guests were better at hiding their discomfort, or maybe she hadn't pushed them as hard as she was pushing him. The conversation began looping in circles now, both of them entrenched in their positions. Kelly insisted that every question she asked was fair and relevant. Channing said they might have been fair in a different context or with a different tone, but her delivery made them feel like attacks. Kelly asked why he was so focused on how she made him feel instead of the substance of what she was asking. Channing said because the how mattered, that communication wasn't just about words but about intent, tone, and respect. Kelly said she had shown him respect by taking him seriously enough to ask substantive questions. Channing disagreed, saying that real respect would have been listening to his answers instead of waiting for her next chance to challenge him. Kelly argued she had listened, but all she heard were evasions and deflections. Channing said what she heard was her own preconceived narrative being confirmed, because that's what she wanted to hear. At this point, the tension in the studio was palpable. Producers were hovering at the edges of the set, and crew members exchanged anxious glances, unsure how to de-escalate the situation. Kelly noticed the commotion and seemed to remember that they were on camera, that this entire exchange was being broadcast live. She softened her tone, suggesting they might have gotten off track and could try to reset, but Channing shook his head. "You can't reset something like this," he said quietly. "The damage is done." The audience, he pointed out, had seen everything unfold. No amount of backtracking would change that. Kelly said she wasn't backtracking, only trying to salvage what was left of the interview. Channing replied there was nothing left to salvage. The conversation had died the moment she turned it adversarial instead of conversational. Kelly's patience cracked. She said she had given him every chance to have a good interview, but he had sabotaged it with his attitude. Channing accused her of rewriting history, saying she had set the tone from the start. He came in ready for a fun, engaging talk, he said, but she turned it into an interrogation. Kelly fired back that if he experienced normal questions as an interrogation, that was his problem, not hers. Channing stepped toward the edge of the stage, his voice steady but cold. He said he genuinely felt sorry for her if this was what she thought good interviewing looked like, that she had a platform and a voice she could use to connect with people, but instead she used it to create conflict. Kelly said she used her platform to hold people accountable, not to let celebrities coast on charm and talking points. Channing replied there was a difference between accountability and antagonism, and she seemed incapable of seeing it. Kelly asked what he wanted from her, an apology for doing her job. Channing said he didn't want anything anymore. He just wanted to leave. This, he said, had been one of the most unpleasant professional experiences of his career, even worse than some of his toughest film shoots. Kelly scoffed, saying she found it hard to believe that being asked a few challenging questions could rank among his worst experiences. Channing replied that it wasn't the questions. It was the tone, the setup, the refusal to engage in good faith. Kelly protested that she had engaged in good faith and that he had met her with hostility. Channing accused her of gaslighting him, trying to make him doubt his own perception of what had just happened. He said everyone watching could see it for themselves. They didn't need her to reframe it. Kelly said the audience was smart enough to decide for themselves who was being reasonable and who was overreacting. Channing agreed, saying he was confident in what conclusion they'd reach. Kelly crossed her arms and challenged him. If he was so confident, why not sit back down and finish the interview properly? Prove he could handle a real conversation. Channing said he had nothing left to prove to her or to anyone watching, that his work spoke for itself and this circus didn't change that. Kelly warned that walking away would only make him look worse, confirming everything she'd suggested about him not being able to handle pressure. Channing stopped near the exit, turning to face her one last time. He said it was fascinating that she was now trying to manipulate him into staying by threatening his reputation, and that it was exactly the kind of tactic he'd expect from someone who had been acting in bad faith all along. Kelly insisted she wasn't manipulating anyone, only stating reality. Walking out mid-interview would be seen as running away. The silence that followed was heavy. The cameras were still rolling, the audience frozen, waiting to see what Channing would do next. Channing said he was making a conscious choice not to participate in something toxic, explaining that there was strength in knowing when to walk away from a situation that wasn't serving anyone. Kelly countered that it was serving her audience, who deserved to see how he handled himself under pressure. Channing replied that her audience deserved better than watching a host berate a guest for entertainment value. Kelly's face flushed as she denied berating him, insisting she had only asked questions, and that he was the one who had fallen apart. Channing told her to stop lying, to stop rewriting what had just happened in front of everyone. The cameras had caught everything, he said, and the footage would speak for itself. Kelly said she welcomed that, claiming the footage would vindicate her completely. Channing shook his head and said that if she truly believed that, she was more delusional than he thought. The insult lingered in the air, hardening Kelly's expression into something cold and final. Turning toward the wings, Kelly gestured sharply and told Channing that if he wasn't going to participate respectfully, if he was going to resort to personal insults, then maybe it was time for him to leave. Channing said he'd been trying to leave, but she was the one who kept engaging. Kelly clarified that she meant leave the studio entirely, that this appearance was over. Channing said that was fine by him. He couldn't get out of there fast enough. But Kelly wasn't finished. She told him she had tried to give him a fair platform and have a meaningful conversation, but he had made that impossible. Channing countered that the only thing she'd tried to do was make him look bad to boost her ratings. Kelly dismissed that as a paranoid fantasy, saying not everything was about him. Channing replied that this interview certainly was, considering she'd spent the entire time attacking him instead of actually interviewing him. Kelly called over one of the producers hovering nearby, clearly uncertain how to intervene. She told them Channing needed to be escorted out, that the interview was terminated. The producer looked uncomfortable, glancing between them, unwilling to step in. Channing told the producer not to worry, that he was leaving voluntarily and didn't need an escort. Kelly said she just wanted to ensure he left without causing any more disruption. Channing asked what disruption she was referring to, beyond defending himself from her attacks. Kelly snapped that his entire demeanor had been disruptive, that he had turned what should have been a pleasant interview into chaos. Channing retorted that she had turned it into a disaster, and he had simply responded to what she created. Kelly accused him of refusing to take responsibility for his behavior. Channing threw the same accusation back at her, saying she needed to take responsibility for how she had conducted herself. He warned her that this moment would follow her, that people would see it and question whether they wanted to go through the same treatment. Kelly said she wasn't worried. Her show had a strong reputation, and one difficult guest wouldn't change that. Channing replied that he wasn't the difficult one, and time would tell who the audience believed. A producer quietly suggested cutting to commercial, but Kelly ignored it, keeping her focus on Channing. She told him she'd interviewed thousands of people and managed to have productive conversations with nearly all of them. The common denominator in this disaster, she said, was him. Channing disagreed, saying the common denominator was her approach, her tone, and her unwillingness to engage with any perspective but her own. Kelly repeated her order to have him removed, her voice louder now, sharper. Channing raised his hands and said there was no need for dramatics. He was already leaving. He began walking toward the exit but paused and turned back one last time. He told Kelly he hoped she would reflect on what had happened, that she would consider whether this was truly the kind of interviewer she wanted to be. Kelly said she knew exactly what kind of interviewer she was and she was proud of it. Channing shook his head, saying that was the saddest part of all because if she couldn't recognize her own part in this disaster, nothing he said would matter. Kelly shot back that the only disaster was his inability to handle basic scrutiny. Channing said he could handle scrutiny just fine. What he couldn't handle was disrespect disguised as journalism. Kelly snapped that she wasn't a journalist. She was a talk show host. And if he had understood the difference, maybe the interview would have gone better. Channing replied that whether she called herself a host or a journalist, respect and good faith should still apply. Kelly said respect was earned, not automatically given just because someone was famous. Channing said he had never asked for special treatment, just basic human decency, and apparently that was too much to expect. Kelly insisted she had shown him decency, and he had thrown it back in her face. Channing said her version of decency was unrecognizable to him. By now, security personnel were visible near the stage, though they seemed reluctant to intervene. Channing noticed them and laughed bitterly, saying that having security there only reinforced her narrative that he was the problem. Kelly replied that she was merely taking precautions, as his behavior had been unpredictable. Channing said the only unpredictable thing was how far she would go to paint herself as the victim in a situation she had created. Kelly told him his time was up and he needed to leave. Channing replied that his time had been up the moment he realized what kind of interview this was going to be. Before walking off, Channing turned to the audience and apologized. He said he was sorry they had to witness this and that it wasn't what anyone had signed up for. Kelly accused him of trying to manipulate the audience, of playing for sympathy. Channing said there was nothing manipulative about it. He genuinely felt bad for how things had turned out. Then, without another word, he walked off the stage for the last time. Kelly watched him go, her face unreadable, before turning back to the camera. She took a deep breath and told the audience they'd be right back after a commercial break. But her voice was tight, her shoulders tense. As the cameras cut away, the studio fell into heavy silence, everyone processing what they had just witnessed. So what really caused this explosion between Kelly Clarkson and Channing Tatum? Was Kelly just doing her job as a hard-hitting interviewer, or did she cross a line? Did Channing overreact, or was he justified in walking away? Let us know your thoughts. Who do you think was in the wrong, and what would you have done in that situation?